Welcome to the Bite Pod, where we dive into the most pressing issues in trade and compliance and risk management. I'm your host, Ann Retho, and today we're exploring future trends in trade and export. So from sanctions to port controls and new administrations, we'll discuss what's on the horizon and how businesses can prepare. So joining me today, we have Tariq Kara, the founder of Byte. Tariq has an extensive background in regulatory technology and data analytics, and has helped organizations and governments use data to mitigate risks and uncover opportunities. So Tariq, welcome.
Thanks, Anne.
And also joining us today is attorney Tim O'Toole. And Tim is a partner at Miller and Chevalier, and is one of the nation's leading attorneys in export controls, sanctions, and international trade law. Tim has worked on some extremely complex and high-profile trade cases and helps businesses navigate legal and regulatory challenges in the ever-changing trade world and environment. So Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Great to be here.
So I think first, Tim, we'll just ask you to kick us off with a little bit of background on your experience and just what you do, and let our listeners get to know you a little bit.
Sure thing. So I run a group of export control, trade, CFIUS, sanctions lawyers at Miller and Chevalier. There's about 6 of us in the group. We handle a lot of sanctions matters, a lot of export control matters, a lot of CFIUS matters, and what's happening now is we're getting pulled into more tariff matters, and I think that will probably increase over the coming weeks, months, and years with the incoming Trump administration.
Great, thanks so much. Kind of to that point, with your group and your opinions, what would you say are the biggest factors that are shaping global trade today generally?
Sure. So I guess in global trade right now, you can probably divide the trade considerations up into 4 major buckets. One is sanctions, which has been a huge trade issue with the Biden administration. The Biden administration has really pulled together a multilateral coalition with respect to the sanctions against Russia as part of a foreign policy consideration arising out of the Ukraine war. And sanctions are basically, they're trade restrictions directed at a particular country or particular individuals for usually national security reasons. And so we've seen that with the Russia sanctions. We also have the Iran sanctions, the Venezuela sanctions for some of the same reasons. So another bucket is export controls. So export controls are also trade restrictions on exports that, and usually licensing restrictions, sometimes prohibitions, that are placed on certain items. Basically, they're item by item and they're country by country, but they're much more global than sanctions. Sanctions are targeted usually at one country or even one individual. Export controls are uniform. We actually have agreements internationally. The main one is this Wassenaar agreement that lots of countries are involved with, where they try to harmonize export controls. Another bucket is imports, which is where we would see the tariffs come in. Our group doesn't do as many import issues, although we're kind of starting to gear up on the tariffs, but I have a partner, Richard Mojica, who does a lot of import issues. And then a 4th bucket is kind of investment restrictions. And so we deal with a lot of restrictions on foreign investment in the United States. The acronym, because everything in Washington has an acronym, is CFIUS for that, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, where a multi-agency committee reviews certain types of foreign direct investments in U.S. companies, and the president and the committee can either disapprove them, or they can approve them, or they can approve them with certain conditions. And CFIUS has grown more and more powerful over the last 7 years, and the types of investments that it looks at are more and more powerful. And in fact, in the last year or so, the Biden administration has adopted something that people call reverse CFIUS, and that is restrictions on outbound investment from the United States, mostly at this point directed at China, although it's a little broader than that. And so we deal with investment issues as well. So those are the basic buckets of trade that we deal with at Northern Chevalier and in our group.
That's quite a wide range of kind of regulatory or I guess compliance related issues. So that's pretty impressive. On the export side, actually my business partner Tim Gilday worked with Homeland Security investigations for quite a number of years, and I got to hear about some of his export control cases, some with some pretty large companies, and it's a fascinating space. He was primarily with counterproliferations investigations, so which in itself, kind of does have fairly complex regulations and, WMD related items that they have to follow. And, I supported on the data side at HSI in the early 2010s, kind of helping them get customs data to do some of that investigative work, and got kind of introduced to that whole space, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that's great. And Tim's a great guy. I've worked with him too, and he knows a ton about export controls and BIS, the Commerce Department's kind of group that focuses on both export controls and imports into the US, and the electronic forms and records that are created and kind of how to navigate those. And so that's a really critical part of the process in terms of figuring out kind of what are we looking at in terms of violations and compliance.
Yeah, and the uptick on just the kind of even on just the Russian sanctions, it's been quite immense. We've supported a couple of agencies on, kind of identifying illicit trade related to some of the Russian companies, and we're hoping to kind of take a deeper look at the statistics around how much those sanctions related the listings have increased in the EU and the US over the years. But what do you see happening on the Russian side in the upcoming administration?
So it's a great question. So, the Russian side, first off, the Russian sanctions have two real components. There's both the sanctions side and an export controls piece. And that is actually a trend that we've been seeing in the last few years, where you have an export control that really looks a lot more like a sanction. And we've seen that with Russia. Then we also have the sanctions piece, which is administered by Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, so that you essentially have kind of usually financial restrictions combined with trade, good restrictions on the export into Russia. And that's what we've seen with the Russian sanctions so far. In terms of where they would go, I'm hearing kind of mixed signals coming out of the current administration. So I've heard rumblings, and certainly it came up a little bit in the campaign, that President Trump is going to be inclined to use sanctions less in this administration than he did in his first administration, and focus more on tariffs. But on the other hand, the sanctions generally have been an issue that President Trump, used quite aggressively in his first term. And so, when on a general subject, I'll be surprised if we see much sanctions reduction, except in the context of specific deals. And I think that's important to consider with respect to Russia, because President Trump did run on the idea that he would be able to resolve the Ukraine war actually before he took office. And the question is how, and he didn't talk about it in the campaign, and that's understandable. I mean, President Nixon did that back in the 60s, talked about ending the Vietnam War, but wouldn't say how, because if you have a plan, telegraphing that plan off, through public media doesn't make a ton of sense. But if he is going to end the war in Ukraine, one aspect of that has to be sanctions relief. I would expect that would be something that would be negotiated. And so if that is part of the plan, you could see why they wouldn't telegraph that they're planning to lower sanctions, because it becomes less of a bargaining chip. On the other hand, it's really hard to see how they do a deal like that without some form of sanctions relief. And I also think that in the Biden administration, it was clear, at least to me, I mean, people from the inside might say different, but my perception of both OFAC and BIS was that granting licenses related to Russia, and certainly for parties who are sanctioned as part of the Russian sanctions program or placed on export control lists, was extraordinarily low priority. Like, you could put a license application in to try, or you could put a delisting application in, and it wouldn't go anywhere. I suspect that the Trump administration might change that priority, because I think that, the war in Ukraine seemed to be the biggest foreign policy pursuit of the Biden administration, actually pursuing it and aggressively stopping the Russian invasion. I suspect that that will not be President Trump's major goal, at least based on what he said in the campaign. It's resolving the war as opposed to ensuring that Ukraine, quote unquote, wins the war. And because of that, I would expect that there'll be a less hostile attitude towards those who are sanctioned. It will be more traditional in the sense that, you file something and OFAC considers it in due course, as opposed to putting everything on the bottom of the pile, which my perception is that OFAC and BIS have put everything on the bottom of the pile if you're asking for something from the Russian side.
Got it. Got it. No, that's super interesting, and yeah, fascinating take on the methodologies around what could happen from a sanctions perspective. And I forget exactly what happened in starting in 2016 in President Trump's first stint, but I think there was also Iran seemed to bubble up a bit more, I think, during that first presidential cycle. But what about Iran?
Yeah, I think that's another really interesting area, because in the 2016 campaign, it was a big issue. So President Trump campaigned pretty hard in 2016 on the idea that President Obama's deal with Iran, the nuclear deal that reduced some of the U.S. sanctions on Iran, was a terrible deal, and that the U.S. needed to renegotiate it or withdraw. And so he came into office, took that position. According to a number of reports and things that I've heard, there was a real effort to get Iran to renegotiate the deal. Iran, kind of understandably, I mean, they had a deal. Why would you want to renegotiate the deal when you have a deal? But Iran said, we've got a deal. We're not going to renegotiate the deal. The U.S. pulled out, and then President Trump went back, according to a number of reports that I've seen and heard, and said, okay, now we want to renegotiate the deal. And Iran said no. And so at that point, President Trump gave up, put what they called maximum pressure on Iran. That's actually continued for the most part in the Biden administration. I'd say that the pressure on Iran and Iran trade, particularly in the oil industry right now, is as aggressive as it was in the Trump administration, if not more so. Now, there was a pause. I mean, President Biden ran in 2020 on getting back into the nuclear deal. And by all accounts, there were a lot of negotiations. And I've heard we were kind of this close to getting back in the nuclear deal in 21, 22. But then after the human rights issues, particularly with respect to women, flared up in Iran, and then after October 7th, that deal basically became, that option became dead, and so obviously the Biden administration never got anything done with Iran. I think looking into the Trump administration and that background, I think is important to try and figure out what President Trump might do. I mean, I have a couple of principles that make me a little bit optimistic, weirdly. One is that President Trump loves to make deals. I mean, that's how he became kind of in the public consciousness, was, back in the 80s with his book on the art of the deal. He is, sees himself as a deal maker. He ran in 2016 on negotiating a better deal than Obama. So I still think that if he could do it, President Trump would like to cut a deal with Iran if he could cut the right deal. I think that Iran has a relatively new president who, I think it was a surprise when he won, but he was the moderate candidate in the Iranian presidential elections after the prior president of Iran was killed in a helicopter crash. And so, and that president, the president of Iran, has also said things that I've read that suggest that he would be interested in at least talking to incoming President Trump about a deal. Now, that means that you've kind of got two people in place who at least are saying the right things about wanting to cut a deal. That doesn't get you there, because it's been very hard for the US and Iran to cut a deal. There's a lot of differences between the two, obviously. But, and also, the third factor that I'd kind of look at with this is that Iran is kind of in the middle of a clash with Israel, and sometimes it's a hot war and sometimes it's been through proxies. But that is also kind of another factor that may be driving the need to kind of come up with some sort of global resolution in the Middle East that involves some sort of sanctions deal with Iran. So I could see the circumstances are all there for it happening. Now, I've been noting that for about 6 years now, and nothing has happened. So, I mean, so take that with a grain of salt. But I think there are circumstances out there through which you could see the current administration negotiating a deal with Iran. And I also think that President Trump has a bargaining chip that President Biden, President Obama really didn't have at their disposal. The only way that the Iran sanctions could be fully lifted, so the US part of the Iran sanctions, which were not lifted in the nuclear deal. So the nuclear deal only dealt with US sanctions that were imposed against, they're called secondary sanctions, but non-US trade. So like we have sanctions that tell UK, tell France, tell the UAE, if you trade with Iran in certain industries, we reserve the right to put sanctions on you, even without any connection to the US. Those sanctions were lifted as part of the nuclear deal, but that was it. And those, that was significant relief, but it wasn't, the same thing as lifting US sanctions. President Trump, because he does have such control over the Republican Party, and because we have, a Republican House and a Republican Senate, could conceivably negotiate a deal that lifted more than just these secondary sanctions, that lifted some of the primary sanctions, the ones that involve US companies or US goods or US financial system. And as a result of that, I really think that President Trump is kind of in a good position to negotiate a deal with Iran for just a variety of reasons. He's said that he likes to negotiate deals. You've got a leader in Iran who's talking about negotiating with President Trump. So as dark as it seems in the Middle East right now, I do think that there's some room for optimism.
Yeah, optimism is always welcomed. I'm doing all the questions though, Anne. Go ahead.
No, this has been a great discussion so far. I might pivot back into something you mentioned earlier with the incoming administration, and that's tariffs. I know you said you don't do a lot with tariffs, but you seem to really have an ear for what's going on. So what's your outlook on tariffs?
Well, so unlike sanctions, tariffs were a big issue in this administration. I mean, one of probably 2 or 3 entire pillars of President Trump's stated economic policy coming in has involved the use of tariffs. And I haven't kind of sat down and done a diagram of all the different types of tariffs that President Trump has suggested they might be imposing. But at the very least, we've heard discussion of tariffs on China, tariffs on Mexico, tariffs on Canada, and then just lots of talk about how President Trump really likes tariffs and was only interested in picking advisors at Treasury and at Commerce who had said things on the record strongly supportive of tariffs. And to that end, Scott Bessent, who is the incoming Treasury Secretary, assuming he gets confirmed, has said things that along the lines of, tariffs actually may make a better tool than sanctions in terms of driving foreign policy issues, so that if a country does things that you're not crazy about, instead of imposing massive sanctions on that country, you impose tariffs on goods coming into the United States with respect to that country. And so I see from that some sign that the Trump administration intends to focus more on tariffs than on sanctions, and that's consistent with what was said in the election. So tariffs are, for people who are not long-time trade nerds, I mean, tariffs are basically taxes that are imposed on goods coming into the United States, and they can be imposed kind of just wholesale. They can be imposed because of a particular trade practice that is concerning. They can be imposed on an entire country. There's different ways to do it. And for the most part, they've been imposed in the last Trump administration under some trade laws that were actually passed specifically for tariffs. They require some fact finding in order for the president to impose tariffs. the fact finding, at least with China, has arguably already been done. And so there's some discussion about how that law could be used, even with this kind of preliminary fact finding that's required by the Commerce Department relatively quickly, because you could just amend some of those fact findings to impose new tariffs on China. But it's a little bit cumbersome because you actually have to do a fact finding first. And in the first Trump administration, there was this lull. I mean, President Trump talks about doing things on day one, but with most of the tariff laws, it's really hard to do things on day one because you need to do fact finding before you can impose the tariffs. But there's been discussion, and this is an area that I know a lot more about in terms of my practice. There's been some discussion of using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs this time around. IEEPA, is a law that is the basis of virtually all the U.S. sanctions programs. And it basically allows the president to declare some sort of foreign policy emergency and then take emergency action immediately without notice to rectify that action. And so that's how most sanctions are imposed. The president declares an emergency with respect to the invasion of Ukraine. And the president issues an executive order that says, in light of this emergency, I'm allowing the Secretary of Treasury to sanction the following types of behaviors. And so lays out kind of what OFAC can do and sometimes what BIS can do with respect to particular sanctions. And so the discussion that I've heard is that IEEPA may well be the basis of the incoming tariffs, so that President Trump could impose tariffs if he wanted to on day one, or at least certain types, through the declaring of a foreign policy emergency. And in some instances, that seems like it's doable. Like then President Trump has talked about declaring emergencies with respect to fentanyl. And that is the sort of emergency that IEEPA has been used for. You declare an emergency with respect to fentanyl, you impose tariffs because in light of the emergency. IEEPA hasn't been used to impose tariffs, but it's been used to impose import restrictions. So it's pretty broad. I'd be surprised if there were a real problem using tariffs. I mean, I could see the legal challenge because, on the other hand, you've got tariff acts. And so the argument would be, we've got tariff laws. You can't kind of use IEEPA to do the same thing that Congress is kind of an end run around these other tariff laws. And I think that's why there's going to be some limits as to how President Trump could use IEEPA. But the fentanyl crisis is the sort of emergency that IEEPA has been used for in the past. It's never been used to justify tariffs, but it was used to justify import restrictions in connection with the Ukraine invasion. So, we have these restrictions on import of Russian oil, restrictions on import of Russian seafood, and I think vodka. And those were all imposed under IEEPA. And so that seems to me to be the premise, a possible premise, if you can find a discrete emergency that the tariffs are responding to. I think it'll be a lot harder to use IEEPA to just say, we don't think the Chinese are competing fairly, and therefore we're going to impose a 60% tariff under IEEPA against China. I think that one might be much more within the realm of the Tariff Act. But I think that's kind of the groundwork for the tariffs that are coming in, is that some could be slow, but there is this, I guess, rising notion that IEEPA might be used and that some of the tariffs could come in even on day one.
Eric, you're on mute.
Sorry, I did not know that connection to IEEPA and sanctions. That's super interesting. But switching now kind of to export control a bit. What's your general feeling? So we on the bite side, we do a lot of screening, right? So we focus on HTS, the ECCN number. We look at the combined nomenclature from the EU. What's your general kind of take on some of the classification, methodologies and processes, and if there's a way to kind of make those a bit more streamlined, especially between the US and EU? Is that kind of something you've gone into before?
In terms of classification of products and making them kind of more uniform, we have seen some of that recently from the Commerce Department. So right now, the goal of at least the export control classification numbers, like the entire kind of export control system, is that you have this Wassenaar arrangement, and the countries that are parties to that arrangement, which includes a whole lot of countries, including Russia, which is kind of the issue that I'm going to get to. But there's a lot of countries that are parties to this Wassenaar Agreement. And so what they do is they meet periodically, and when new technologies come out, they decide whether they should be classified for export and then what they should be classified for. And it's a pretty uniform system. And it moves slowly, but then the member states have to go back and adopt that rule in their system. They usually move by consensus. It's very hard to get a new ECCN or changes to current ECCNs, the classification numbers, with any country that's objecting. And so what we've seen in terms of Wassenaar is that it's ground to a halt. And that has been a particular problem for things like chips and for things like artificial intelligence and other new technologies, or rapidly evolving technologies, or rapidly improving technologies, where there seems to be a pretty big consensus that the higher level chips and computers and artificial intelligence and quantum computing need to be more strictly regulated because they do have a number of military purposes. That said, you can understand that as part of the Wassenaar Agreement, Russia is not anxious to go along with those improvements, because one of the things that the higher level ECCN would do is restrict those products to Russia. So it's not inclined to go along with that, and would restrict those export of those products potentially to countries that have been kind of highlighted as diversion hubs to Russia. And so if the new export controls make it harder to export items to places like Turkey, as a practical matter, that makes it harder for Russia to get those items. So Wassenaar has kind of ground to a halt on a number of issues after the beginning of the Ukraine conflict. And so what's happened is, in the last 6 months or so, the US has come up with an entirely new ECCN on its own, because the US has had unilateral controls for a while, but for the most part, US unilateral controls were pretty minor. They were like anti-terrorism controls that would only restrict products to sanctioned countries that have been found to be state sponsors of terrorism. But otherwise, the US unilateral controls really didn't impose additional licensing restrictions. But they came up with this new unilateral ECCN that is aimed at those sorts of products. So AI, semiconductors, and quantum computing. And it is a control that requires a license to go anywhere. So if a product qualifies for these ECCNs, you need a license to send it anywhere in the world. Now, it takes away that licensing requirement. There's a license exception that applies if the destination country has adopted similar export controls for that product. So essentially, coercing, some would say, encouraging, others would say, countries around the world that want to receive those US exports to adopt similar controls to essentially try and prevent diversion to third countries, so that it's kind of a way to restrict these items, incredibly restrict them. I mean, most items on the commerce control list, most items with an ECCN, don't require a license to go to most countries in the world. There's usually a way around the licensing requirement, or there isn't one at all for most countries. But on this one, there's a strict licensing requirement for everywhere unless that country adopts the same controls. So it basically opts out of Wassenaar and says to other countries around the world, and these countries, since the adoption of this, have started to adopt the same sort of controls very, very quickly. I think when they did this, there were like 1 or 2, and now I think the last I looked, it was up to about 20. And so it's kind of a new way to streamline controls, to your question, Tariq, between the US and EU. So and that's mostly the countries that have been adopting these same sort of restrictions on these new products. So they basically created a new system. It's still got the Wassenaar nomenclature, so there's still a 5-digit ECCN, but it is very different from Wassenaar in that it's not an ECCN that Wassenaar recognizes, but there's a strong encouragement to adopt one of your own, or else you won't be able to get US products.
Interesting. Yeah, and we've also started to kind of dig into the the assembly and the sub-assemblies, and how to kind of construct screening around that. If one part has, a control around it, what happens to the rest of the sub-assembly, and, risks like that in the supply chain, I think are super interesting to us anyways.
No, that's a great tool, because that really is often a problem in terms of compliance, is that there's a lot of products. This surprised me when I first got into this area. There's a lot of products where parts that are inside the whole product are much more tightly controlled than the end product itself. Cars are like that. There's a lot of products in cars that, particularly newer cars that have a lot of advanced digital technology in them, that are controlled for export, some even relatively highly, but the car itself is, the lightest control. It's EAR99 for the car. And I guess the theory is that, just one of these and, put into a car so that you'd have to do a lot of work to get it out is not that dangerous for export, in a way that if you actually were exporting that product as a whole, just that product, it could lead to a lot more significant consequences. I guess they just don't think the Chinese military is going to go to a bunch of US cars and start pulling the chips out and using them, is the theory. But it surprised me a lot when I heard about it. So that's great that you guys have tools that can kind of break that down, because I think it's a common area where people get confused.
Great. Tarek, do you have any more questions? You're on a roll here.
No, go ahead, Ann.
No, I think, this has been super interesting. I don't have anything else on my mind, except, Tim, if you have any advice for businesses and how they can prepare for all of this, I think that would be my last question.
Sure. So one of the things that I've learned in working with the agencies quite a bit is that automated tools, like the screening tools that Tarek talked about, like the tools to try and map your supply chain, are something that the agencies are looking for in terms of compliance, both in terms of kind of giving your company the gold star, but also in terms of if you get into trouble, which everybody does because these rules are so complicated, in terms of what they pretty much demand that you do to remediate these issues. And so those sorts of solutions are really the cutting edge of export control compliance. So it's great that you guys have them, and thanks for having me on.
Thank
Yeah, thank
you.
you. Yeah, really appreciate your time, Tim, and all the best in Costa Rica. Sounds
All right.
lovely and warm.
So far, it's like 80 degrees. So I hear that it's a little colder in Washington.
Just a little bit.
Well, thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into the Bite Pod. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on upcoming episodes. And we'll be back next month. Until next time, have a great month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.